He walked in as just another customer. A simple steak order at his own luxury restaurant. But when the manager humiliated a young waiter right in front of him, he knew this was more than just bad service, it was a warning sign. What he uncovered next would shake the entire company to its core. The soft hum of conversation filled the lavish dining hall of Le Grand Luxe, a name synonymous with exclusivity in Manhattan's upscale restaurant scene. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in a golden glow, casting shimmering reflections across polished mahogany tables. Tucked within the heart of New York, this establishment was a sanctuary for the elite, CEOs sealing multi-million-dollar deals over aged scotch, politicians whispering in hushed tones behind velvet drapes, and celebrities savoring delicacies crafted by world-renowned chefs. Among them, unnoticed and unassuming, sat Jonathan Reed, dressed in an understated navy suit. He could have passed for any well-to-do patron, but his presence here was not for leisure. As the founder and CEO of Reed Dining Group, the parent company of Le Grand Luxe, he rarely had the opportunity to observe his empire from the ground level. Tonight, he had chosen to dine alone, tucked away in a secluded corner near the bar, watching the room unfold like a silent spectator at a play. Something had been gnawing at him for weeks, whispers of employee dissatisfaction, hints of mismanagement, and a string of high turnover rates at this particular location. The reports didn't sit right with him, and Jonathan had built his empire on instinct. If there was something wrong, he intended to find out firsthand. A server approached his table with practiced grace, placing a glass of Bordeaux in front of him. He barely acknowledged it, his attention drawn to a commotion near the center of the room. A young waiter, no older than his mid-20s, stood frozen, a bottle of wine tilted precariously in his trembling grasp. The deep red liquid dribbled onto the pristine white tablecloth of a distinguished-looking guest, a man in a tailored charcoal suit who now regarded the spill as if it were a personal affront to his existence. Ethan Carter, the name etched onto the waiter's neatly pressed uniform, was visibly mortified. His hands hovered above the mess, unsure whether to reach for a napkin or brace for impact. The air in the restaurant shifted, growing thick with the weight of silent judgment. The VIP guest leaned back in his chair, dabbing at the droplets with exaggerated slowness. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, amusement flickering in his cold eyes as he turned to his companions. Pathetic, he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. They'll hire anyone these days, won't they? A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the table. Ethan swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he forced out an apology, his voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan felt his jaw tighten. The reaction from the guest was unnecessary, condescending, cruel even. But before Ethan could attempt to remedy the situation, a new presence entered the scene. Richard Miller. The restaurant manager moved with a precision that suggested years of practice in wielding power over those beneath him. His slicked back hair and crisp gray suit gave him an air of authority, one he clearly enjoyed exerting. He strode toward the table with an air of exaggerated urgency, his voice cutting through the refined atmosphere like a blade. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Carter?" His words cracked like a whip, sending the already shaken server into further distress. Ethan barely had time to stammer out another apology before Richard snatched the bottle from his grip. "This is a $1,000 bottle of wine, not some cheap grocery store garbage. You can't even handle a simple pour?" Jonathan noted the shift in the room. The other servers had lowered their gazes, hands moving mechanically as they worked. No one intervened, no one dared. It was clear, this wasn't an isolated incident. Ethan, to his credit, tried to explain. "It was an accident, sir." An accident?" Richard scoffed, cutting him off. "I should have fired you weeks ago." He turned back to the guest, his demeanor shifting instantly into obsequious charm. "Sir, we deeply apologize for this inconvenience. Your meal is on the house tonight. And of course, we'll bring you a fresh bottle. Please, let me assure you, this level of incompetence will not be tolerated." The guest gave a dismissive wave, clearly pleased with the response. Then Richard turned back to Ethan. His voice dropped to a level only those closest could hear. But the venom remained. "Take off your apron. You're done." Ethan stiffened. "Sir, please." Now, silence wrapped around them like a heavy fog. Every set of eyes within earshot flicked toward the scene before quickly looking away. unwilling to draw attention to themselves. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against the table. His face betrayed nothing, but inside, a slow burn had begun. He had seen enough. This was not just about a spilled drink or a bad manager. There was something deeper, a rot beneath the surface. And if there was one thing Jonathan despised, it was unchecked power wielded against those who could not fight back. Lifting his glass, he took a measured sip, his gaze steady on Richard. A decision had been made. The manager had no idea that he had just condemned himself in front of the only man in this restaurant who could end his career with a single word. Jonathan remained seated for a few more minutes after Richard turned his back on Ethan. His face betrayed no emotion, but his mind was already piecing together a plan. He had come here tonight suspecting something was amiss, but now he had seen it with his own eyes. This was not just about a single manager acting out of line, there was a pattern. A culture of unchecked abuse festering within his own company. He needed to know how deep it ran. Finishing his drink, he rose from his chair, careful not to attract attention. He left a generous tip on the table, not for the restaurant, but for the young server who had just been humiliated before an audience. As he exited through the grand revolving doors of Le Grand Luxe, he didn't head home. Instead, he made his way to a small office space a few blocks away, where he knew he could access the restaurant's internal systems. Inside, the dim glow of a single monitor illuminated the room as Jonathan logged into the company's surveillance network. He navigated to the live security feed of Le Grand Luxe, selecting a series of time-stamped recordings from earlier in the evening. He fast-forwarded through footage, pausing each time Richard appeared on screen. It didn't take long to confirm his suspicions. This was not an isolated event. Richard didn't just humiliate Ethan. He treated nearly every staff member with the same level of disdain. His tone sharp and belittling. Servers flinched when he walked past, their shoulders stiffening as if bracing for a blow. Meanwhile, he was all smiles and charm for the VIP clientele. If a guest so much as raised an eyebrow, Richard was at their beck and call, ensuring their every whim was met, even if it meant disregarding company policies. More than once, Jonathan watched as Richard directed staff to comp expensive bottles of wine or provide free meals. Costs that had to be covered somewhere. The more Jonathan observed, the clearer it became. Richard wasn't just a bad manager. He was playing a different game altogether. Leaning back in his chair, Jonathan exhaled slowly. He had enough now to act, but acting without a full understanding of the situation could be dangerous. He needed to dig deeper. Switching gears, he pulled up employee records and scanned through the list of current staff at Le Grand Luxe. One name stood out, Sarah Whitman, the assistant manager. She had been with the company for over 8 years, longer than Richard, and had worked her way up from a server. If anyone knew the inner workings of the restaurant, it would be her. Jonathan glanced at the time. It was just past midnight, but that didn't deter him. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. The voice on the other end was groggy but alert. Sarah Whitman speaking. Jonathan didn't bother with pleasantries. I need to talk to you. Privately. There was a pause, then a shift in tone. Mr. Reed? Yes. And I need the truth about Le Grand Luxe. 15 minutes later, Jonathan sat in a quiet corner of an all-night cafe, watching as Sarah slid into the seat across from him. She looked wary, unsure of why the CEO of the company had called her at this hour. I need to know what's happening at Le Grand Luxe, Jonathan said, keeping his voice low. Don't hold back. Sarah hesitated, glancing around the nearly empty cafe before leaning forward. How much do you already know? I know Richard Miller is abusing his authority, but I don't know the full extent. Sarah exhaled, running a hand through her hair. It's worse than you think. He forces staff to work overtime without pay. Schedules shifts in a way that makes it impossible for them to refuse. If someone pushes back, he either cuts their hours or finds a reason to fire them. Jonathan's jaw clenched. And the customers? Sarah gave a bitter laugh. The VIPs get whatever they want. If they complain about service, Richard finds someone to blame, usually a newer employee. He comps meals left and right, knowing the restaurant will have to absorb the cost. And the worst part? He's covering it all up. Jonathan leaned in. Covering it up how? He's falsifying financial reports, she said, lowering her voice, adjusting numbers to make everything look perfect on paper. The losses from the comped meals? He hides them in operational costs. And any complaints from staff? They never make it past him. He either buries them or ensures the employees don't stick around long enough to follow up. Jonathan's mind worked fast. This wasn't just about mistreatment, this was fraud. Does corporate have any idea? He asked. Sarah shook her head. Not as far as I know. He's been positioning himself for a promotion to regional director. He's making Le Grand Luxe look like the most profitable branch in the chain. If he pulls it off, he'll have even more power to manipulate the system. Jonathan sat back, processing the information. If Richard succeeded in moving up, he wouldn't just be a problem for one restaurant, he could infect the entire company. Thank you, Sarah, Jonathan said, his voice firm. But I need one more favor. Anything, she said without hesitation. I need proof. Real proof. Can you get it? Sarah hesitated but then nodded. Give me a couple of days. I'll find something solid. Jonathan knew that was all the time he had. Richard was confident, too confident. That meant he didn't see the trap closing around him. As Sarah left, Jonathan pulled out his phone and opened his email. He scrolled through the latest messages flagged as high priority, stopping at one from Richard himself, sent to the corporate office just days ago. The subject line read, "No issues to report, Le Grand Luxe performance review." Jonathan opened the email and read through its contents. A carefully crafted lie detailing high employee satisfaction, increasing profits, and an impeccable service record. It was almost impressive. Almost. His fingers tightened around the phone as he realized Richard had left himself completely exposed. Jonathan had everything he needed to set the stage. Now, it was time to make his move. He looked up at the cafe's security camera, its red light blinking in the corner. He was no longer just a spectator. Jonathan arrived at Le Grand Luxe the next morning, dressed in a sharp but unassuming navy suit, carrying a leather folder tucked beneath his arm. He had already set his plan in motion. Today, he wasn't here as the CEO, at least. Not publicly. Instead, he was playing a role he had used only a handful of times before, a corporate quality control inspector. Sent from the headquarters to conduct a routine performance audit. It was the perfect cover. If he wanted to expose Richard, he had to do it from within. The moment he stepped inside, he caught the same familiar scent of freshly polished wood and rich truffle butter wafting from the kitchen. The morning shift had just begun, and the staff bustled about, setting tables, reviewing the day's reservations, ensuring every detail was flawless before the first guests arrived. A hostess approached him, her eyes wary but professional. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice polite but cautious. Jonathan gave her a reassuring nod and handed over his credentials, a corporate badge with a name no one at this location would recognize. "I'm here on behalf of Reed Dining Group's Quality Control Division," he said. "Just a standard compliance check. Shouldn't take more than a few hours." The hostess hesitated for only a moment before nodding and leading him toward the back. He could feel eyes on him as they passed through the dining hall, employees whispering, some exchanging nervous glances. That was good. He needed them unsettled, unsure of what was coming. Inside the staff lounge, Richard was nowhere to be seen. But Sarah Whitman stood by the espresso machine, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug. The second she noticed him, her eyes flickered with understanding. "You move fast," she murmured, setting down her drink. Jonathan didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced around to make sure no one else was within earshot. "I need to talk to some of the employees," he said quietly, privately. "Can you arrange that?" Sarah nodded. "They're scared, but if they think this is an official audit, they might talk." 15 minutes later, Jonathan was seated in the manager's office, Richard's office, though the man himself was nowhere to be found. One by one, employees came in, answering his questions with cautious glances toward the door. Most were reluctant to speak, their answers clipped and rehearsed. But a few offered more. One busboy admitted he had worked double shifts without extra pay. A hostess revealed that Richard regularly comped meals for certain VIP guests, then spread the loss across staff wages by cutting hours. And then, finally, came the confirmation Jonathan was waiting for. Sarah entered last, closing the door behind her. "He's been cleaning house," she said. "Anyone who challenges him disappears. Fired, transferred, or pressured into quitting." Jonathan flipped through the files in his folder. Names of employees who had mysteriously left over the past year. There were too many to be coincidence. "Do you have proof?" he asked. She hesitated, then pulled a crumpled sheet of paper from her pocket. "It's not much, but it's a list of people who filed complaints about him in the past 6 months. None of them work here anymore." Jonathan took the paper, scanning the names. This was what he needed. Richard wasn't just a bad manager, he was methodically eliminating threats, one by one. But before Jonathan could press further, a sharp knock interrupted them. "Mr. Miller would like a word," a voice called from the hallway. Sarah stiffened. Jonathan tucked the paper inside his folder and stood. "I'll handle it," he murmured. Richard was waiting for him in the main dining hall, arms crossed, a thin smirk playing at his lips. "Funny," Richard said. "I don't recall anyone from quality control being scheduled today." Jonathan smiled. "Corporate likes surprises. Keeps everyone honest." Richard chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Well, let me know if you need anything," he said, voice smooth, calculated. "After all, I'd hate for you to get the wrong impression of how things are run here." Jonathan met his gaze steadily. "I already have an impression. Now I just need to verify it." Richard's smirk faltered for half a second before he regained his composure. Jonathan didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked away, already knowing what his next move would be. He had gathered enough to confirm his suspicions. But it wasn't enough to take Richard down completely. Not yet. He needed something bigger, something public. That night, he made a call. "I need a favor," Jonathan said. The voice on the other end was familiar. One of his oldest business partners. Someone with a vested interest in making sure Reed Dining Group stayed clean. "I need you to send a few investors to Le Grand Lux tomorrow." Jonathan continued. "Tell them to act like VIP customers. Make them difficult. See how Richard handles it." There was a pause. Then, a knowing laugh. "Setting a trap, are we?" Jonathan smiled for the first time that day. "Something like that." The next evening, a group of impeccably dressed men and women arrived at Le Grand Lux. They were seated at one of the best tables, their presence drawing immediate attention. Richard approached them with his usual charm, offering complimentary wine, ensuring their every request was met without hesitation. What he didn't realize was that every move he made, every comped meal, every policy he bent, was being watched, documented. The real test would come soon. Jonathan watched from his usual corner, fingers tapping against the table as he saw Richard work the room. He had no idea that the walls were closing in. The dinner service at Le Grand Lux was in full swing. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in white linen, where the city's elite sipped aged wine and dined on meticulously plated entrees. Waiters moved in synchronized precision, their smiles polished, their postures straight, their steps purposeful. Beneath the refined atmosphere, however, tension simmered just beneath the surface. At the center of it all, Richard Miller strode through the dining hall. Exuding authority, he exchanged pleasantries with familiar patrons, flashing his trademark smile, ensuring every detail was flawless, at least on the surface. The man prided himself on control, on the ability to mold situations to his advantage. He had done it for years, manipulating the system, ensuring his own rise at the expense of those beneath him. Tonight would be no different. Unbeknownst to him, the night had been carefully orchestrated. At precisely 7:30 p.m., a group of distinguished guests arrived, their presence drawing immediate attention. The hostess, recognizing their status, led them to the best table in the house, where they settled into their seats with an air of quiet expectation. Their suits were tailored, their jewelry understated but unmistakably expensive. They exuded the confidence of people accustomed to power. These were not ordinary diners. Jonathan, seated discreetly at the bar, observed the scene unfold. His guests, the undercover investors, had been briefed in advance. Their task was simple: push Richard to his limits, test his willingness to bend rules, and document every instance of favoritism and financial misconduct. If Richard operated true to form, it would only be a matter of time before he played directly into Jonathan's hands. The first request came within minutes. One of the men, a seasoned investor who had played this game before, called over a waiter and asked for wine that was not on the restaurant's menu. It was an impossible demand, designed to gauge Richard's reaction. The waiter hesitated, explaining that the requested bottle was not available. Richard materialized at the table moments later, his smile unwavering. "I'm sure we can find something comparable," he said smoothly. The investor leaned back, feigning dissatisfaction. "I was hoping for something exclusive." Richard barely hesitated before offering a solution. "Consider it taken care of." Minutes later, a server emerged from the back with a bottle of rare vintage, one that should never have been removed from the restaurant's reserves without explicit authorization. Richard poured generously, assuring his guests that their satisfaction was his priority. He comped the entire bottle without a second thought. Jonathan watched from afar, his fingers wrapped around the base of his glass. He noted the ease with which Richard dismissed protocol, prioritizing VIP indulgence over financial accountability. It was exactly what he had anticipated. The requests escalated. A special dish prepared off-menu. Additional entrees, delivered with urgency. A private tour of the kitchen. Each demand was met with unwavering compliance. Richard didn't just bend the rules, he obliterated them. Every comped service, every overlooked policy, every ignored regulation further solidified the case against him. From a back office, Jonathan monitored the restaurant's security feed, ensuring every exchange was recorded. He wasn't the only one watching. Other employees had taken notice. Servers exchanged wary glances. A few of them, those who had suffered under Richard's rule, began to realize that something unusual was happening. Among them, Ethan stood frozen near the entrance, a folded apron clutched in his hands. He had returned that evening, not as an employee, but as a spectator, drawn back by something he couldn't quite explain. As he observed Richard cater to the fabricated VIPs, a realization settled over him. This wasn't just about favoritism. It was about something bigger. Something that had been happening long before he ever set foot in this restaurant. He turned to find Sarah standing nearby, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "He does this all the time, doesn't he?" Ethan asked quietly. Sarah exhaled. "More than you know." She hesitated, then pulled out her phone and handed it to him. On the screen was a financial report, one she had spent the past 24 hours combing through. "There's a pattern," she continued. "It's not just the free meals. He's been fabricating costs, inflating expenses, shifting money into accounts that don't add up." Ethan frowned as he scanned the data. Sarah lowered her voice. "Richard isn't just covering for the VIPs. He's stealing from the company." The weight of the words sank in. Ethan had spent months feeling powerless, enduring mistreatment, believing there was nothing he could do. But this was different. A few feet away, Jonathan emerged from the office, his expression unreadable. He approached Ethan, meeting his gaze. "You have a choice," Jonathan said. "You can walk away, pretend none of this happened, or you can help me stop him." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. "I'll do it," he said finally. "I'll testify. Whatever you need." Jonathan nodded. "Then let's finish this." The following morning, a meeting was scheduled. The board of directors of Reed Dining Group had been summoned for an emergency session. Jonathan ensured Richard received the invitation personally. Richard, unaware of the extent of the trap that had been set, arrived at the corporate office with his usual confidence. He assumed this was merely a procedural formality, an opportunity to reinforce his narrative of success. He couldn't have been more wrong. Jonathan sat at the head of the conference table, his demeanor calm, composed. Across from him, Richard exuded false bravado, exchanging pleasantries with board members, oblivious to the noose tightening around him. Then the meeting began. Sarah was called in first, presenting her findings with meticulous precision. The board members listened as she outlined the fraudulent expense reports, the fabricated losses, the evidence of financial mismanagement. The silence in the room deepened with every slide, every documented instance of misconduct. Then came the video footage. The board watched as Richard was caught, time and time again, circumventing protocol, authorizing free services, fabricating transactions. His expression remained neutral at first, then, as realization set in, his jaw tightened. Ethan was the final witness. He spoke clearly, recounting his experience under Richard's management, detailing the fear tactics, the mistreatment, the systemic corruption that had flourished unchecked. He did not waver. He did not falter. By the time he finished, the verdict was clear. Jonathan folded his hands on the table, his gaze unwavering. This company was built on integrity. He said, "What happens next will determine whether we still stand by that principle." Richard remained silent, his face pale. The board cast their votes. Unanimous. Richard Miller was officially removed from his position. Outside, the city moved as it always did, oblivious to the power shift that had just occurred. But inside that boardroom, a chapter had closed. Jonathan knew, however, that the real battle was only beginning. The air inside the private conference room of Le Grand Lux was thick with anticipation. The walls, lined with sleek mahogany panels, reflected the glow of the recessed lighting, casting elongated shadows across the polished table where the board members of Reed Dining Group sat. At the head of the room, a vacant seat awaited the restaurant's general manager, Richard Miller, who had yet to arrive. Jonathan sat at the far end of the table, his expression unreadable. He had chosen a position that offered him full view of the room, allowing him to study each person as they spoke, as they reacted. To his left sat Sarah Whitman, her back straight, hands clasped in her lap. Next to her was Ethan, shifting in his chair, his fingers tapping against his knee in nervous rhythm. They were the only two employees present, but Jonathan had ensured their inclusion. After all, they had been the ones to suffer under Richard's rule the longest. Tonight, that ended. The door swung open, and Richard entered with his usual air of authority. He strode into the room, nodding curtly at the board members as if this were nothing more than another procedural meeting. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won, unaware that he was stepping directly into a carefully laid trap. "Let's get this over with," Richard said, sliding into his chair. "I assume we're here to discuss the quarterly reports?" Jonathan remained silent, letting the board's chairman take the lead. The older man, a seasoned investor with years of experience, leaned forward. "There have been concerns," the chairman said, specifically regarding the financial management of Le Grand Lux. Richard's smile barely faltered. "Concerns? If anything, this restaurant has been one of the highest performing locations in the entire chain." Jonathan let the moment hang before he finally spoke, his voice even. "Then you won't mind answering a few questions." Richard turned, finally acknowledging Jonathan for the first time. He gave him a polite, almost dismissive nod. "And you are?" Jonathan leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Someone very interested in the truth." Richard chuckled, but it lacked genuine amusement. "Of course." Jonathan opened a folder, glancing down at the documents inside before lifting his gaze once more. "Let's start simple. Can you explain why there have been multiple unapproved expenses written off under VIP accommodations in the past 6 months? Richard didn't miss a beat. "VIPs are the backbone of our clientele. Offering them a superior experience ensures they keep returning, which, in turn, guarantees revenue growth. It's an investment, not a loss." Jonathan nodded, flipping to the next page. "And the pattern of terminations? This location has dismissed more employees in 6 months than any other restaurant in the group." "Care to explain?" Richard's smile thinned. "Underperformance. High standards require constant evaluation. Some people simply don't belong in this industry." Jonathan set the folder down and clasped his hands on the table. "So, you're saying there's been no misconduct? No financial mismanagement?" Richard's jaw tightened slightly. "None whatsoever." A quiet beat passed before Jonathan gestured toward Sarah. She stood, stepping forward with a folder of her own. "What is this?" Richard asked, his voice losing its practiced ease. Sarah's fingers trembled slightly, but she steadied herself. "A financial report. The real one." She placed it on the table, and the chairman reached for it, scanning the pages with furrowed brows. Jonathan let the silence linger as the weight of the evidence settled in. Sarah continued, her voice stronger now. "It outlines every comped meal Richard authorized without corporate approval. The false expense reports, the payroll manipulations." Ethan rose next, his voice cutting through the growing tension. "And the unpaid overtime, the threats, the employees he forced out for questioning his authority." Richard shifted in his chair, his face darkening. This is ridiculous. Fabricated nonsense from disgruntled employees. Jonathan picked up the financial report and flipped through a few pages before speaking again. If that's the case, then perhaps you can explain these altered invoices. Richard's confidence wavered. He reached for a glass of water, taking a slow sip before setting it down with more force than necessary. I don't have time to go through every minor discrepancy. Jonathan cut him off. Then explain this. He pulled out another document. An email. One that had been buried deep within internal correspondence. Retrieved only after Sarah had spent hours combing through records. It was from Richard to corporate. In it, he had stated, under oath, that there were no employee complaints. That the financials were clean. That there was nothing to investigate. Silence stretched across the room. Richard's fingers curled into a fist. But he didn't respond. He couldn't. Jonathan let the moment drag before he finally pushed back his chair and stood. He reached for his glasses, removing them slowly before leveling his gaze at the man sitting across from him. You're lying, Jonathan said, his voice calm, but with an edge that cut through the tension like a blade. Richard scoffed, but the sound was hollow. And who the hell do you think you are? Jonathan exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath. Then, in a voice that carried no trace of warmth, he spoke. I'm Jonathan Reed. The name landed like a thunderclap. Every board member's expression shifted. The weight of realization settled over the room. And for the first time, Richard's confidence cracked. Jonathan continued. I built this company from the ground up. I've watched over every location, every decision, every success and failure, and I have spent the last 2 weeks watching you. Richard swallowed, his throat working. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. You think you've covered your tracks. You think you've outmaneuvered everyone in this room. But you made one mistake. Richard forced a smirk. And what's that? Jonathan dropped a thick stack of documents onto the table. You got greedy. He let the words settle. Richard's face paled as he glanced down at the files. The evidence was overwhelming. Jonathan's voice remained steady. You have 2 choices. 1. You resign immediately, quietly, walk away, and this stays internal. He paused, then added, or 2. I press charges, and your name becomes a permanent stain on this industry. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the documents. Flipping through the pages, his breathing had grown uneven, his skin taking on a faint sheen of sweat. Jonathan didn't blink, decide. The room remained silent, every pair of eyes locked on the man at the center of it all. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked around, searching for support, but found none. For the first time in his career, Richard Miller was out of options. Richard sat motionless for a moment, his eyes scanning the faces around the room. He had been in difficult situations before, but never like this. He could feel the ground shifting beneath him, the power he had so carefully built slipping through his fingers. But he wasn't done, not yet. He forced out a chuckle, shaking his head as if he found the entire situation absurd. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice sharp. You're all going to take the word of a disgruntled former employee and a bitter assistant manager? He turned his gaze toward Ethan first. This kid couldn't even pour a glass of wine without making a fool of himself. You think his word is worth anything? Ethan stiffened but didn't look away. The insult stung, but he had expected worse. Richard's attention snapped to Sarah. And you, let me guess, this is your power move? Take me down so you can slide into my seat? Is that what this is? Sarah's hands clenched into fists. But she didn't respond. Jonathan had told her to expect this, to expect Richard to lash out, to try and undermine their credibility. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of reacting. Jonathan, meanwhile, remained completely still, his fingers lightly tapping against the edge of the table. He had seen people like Richard before. When backed into a corner, they always did the same thing: deny, deflect, and attack. The predictable nature of it almost bored him. Enough, Jonathan said, his tone calm but firm. You can insult them all you want, but that won't change the facts. He turned to one of the board members. Bring in the company's head of accounting. Within minutes, the chief financial officer of Reed Dining Group entered the room. A tall, no-nonsense woman with graying hair. She sat down at the table and adjusted her glasses. Jonathan slid a folder toward her. I need you to verify something for us. She opened the file, scanning the pages. A frown creased her brow. These numbers don't add up, she muttered. Several of these expense reports don't align with our internal records. Richard shifted in his chair. It's an accounting error, he said quickly. These things happen in a system this large. The CFO didn't look up. Not like this. The tension in the room thickened. Several board members exchanged glances. Then, unexpectedly, someone else spoke. Maybe we should reconsider this approach. The voice came from a man near the end of the table, one of the company's senior financial executives. Mark Caldwell. Jonathan had kept his eye on him during the meeting, noticing how quiet he had been up until now. Mark leaned forward, adjusting the cuff of his expensive suit. Richard has been with us for years. He's overseen this location's most profitable period. There's no proof that any of this was intentional. Jonathan tilted his head slightly. There it was. The ally Richard had been counting on. He exhaled slowly before responding. You're right, we can't rely on assumptions. That's why I brought in an independent audit team to go over the records. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out another file. Here's what they found. He slid the documents across the table, watching as several board members picked them up. The room fell silent as they read. Large sums of money had been moved around, untraceable transactions, falsified invoices, discrepancies that pointed to only one conclusion. The numbers didn't lie. Richard's face darkened. Jonathan leaned back in his chair. Still think it's an accounting error? Mark hesitated, then slowly leaned back, saying nothing. Richard, realizing his last line of defense had crumbled, clenched his jaw, but he still had one final card to play. If I go down, he said, his voice low, I won't be the only one. The boardroom went completely silent. Richard straightened his tie, his confidence returning slightly. You think this company is clean? You think I'm the only one who's made deals behind closed doors? I know things, Jonathan, things that could ruin people in this very room. Jonathan didn't blink. Then you should have known better than to play this game with me. Richard narrowed his eyes. You want to dig deeper? Fine, but don't expect to like what you find. Jonathan tapped his fingers against the table once, twice. Then he leaned forward. Then I'll investigate it all, he said simply. But today, we're starting with you. The silence stretched. One of the board members finally cleared his throat. I think it's time we vote. The decision was swift. An overwhelming majority voted for Richard's immediate dismissal. A company lawyer slid a termination document across the table. You can sign this and leave quietly, she said, or we can move forward with legal action. Richard's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the pen. He hesitated, his jaw tightening. His eyes flicked toward Jonathan, full of barely restrained fury. Jonathan met his gaze, unreadable. Seconds ticked by before Richard finally pressed the pen to paper. The moment the ink dried, security entered the room. Please escort Mr. Miller off the premises, Jonathan said, his voice even. Richard stood, straightening his jacket. You think this is over? He muttered. Jonathan didn't respond. He didn't need to. As Richard walked toward the door, he cast one last glance at Ethan and Sarah. There was something in his eyes, not defeat, but something more dangerous, a quiet promise. Then he was gone. For a moment, the room remained silent. Then, slowly, Sarah exhaled. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Jonathan glanced at the remaining board members. This isn't just about one person, he said. Richard was a symptom of a larger problem. If we don't change the way we run this company, there will be more like him. A few members nodded. Others looked uneasy. Jonathan turned to Sarah and Ethan. We start fixing this now. He reached for the folder containing Richard's records and placed it at the center of the table. He's gone. But how many more Richard Millers are still in this company? Jonathan sat in his office, staring at the termination document that had sealed Richard Miller's fate just hours earlier. It should have felt like a victory. The man had been exposed, stripped of his title, and removed from the company. But the unease gnawing at Jonathan's gut refused to fade. He had dealt with enough corruption in his career to know that one man alone couldn't manipulate a system of this scale. Richard hadn't operated in a vacuum. Someone else had benefited from his schemes. And if they remained in the shadows, this wasn't over. The boardroom had been filled with mixed reactions when Richard was forced out. Some members had been relieved, even satisfied, but others had seemed wary, uneasy, not because they disagreed with Richard's punishment, but because of what it could mean for them. Jonathan had caught the way certain board members avoided eye contact, how a few whispered to each other in hushed tones before quickly exiting the room. If there were others complicit in Richard's schemes, they would be scrambling now, either to cover their tracks or to prepare for a fight. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Sarah stepped inside, holding a folder close to her chest. Her expression was tight, her usual composure slightly shaken. "I found something," she said, closing the door behind her. Jonathan gestured for her to sit. "Go on." She placed the folder on his desk and opened it, revealing a stack of printed emails. These were buried deep in the system. Some of them are months old, but they paint a clear picture. Jonathan scanned the pages, his frown deepening. The emails detailed internal conversations between several high-ranking members of the company, conversations that suggested Richard wasn't acting alone. One message, in particular, caught his eye. It was from Mark Caldwell, the financial director who had attempted to downplay Richard's actions during the meeting. "Make sure the numbers balance before the next report. We can't afford any mistakes." Another email, from an unnamed sender, was more alarming. "Keep everything running smoothly. If one piece falls, the rest will follow." Jonathan exhaled through his nose. They knew. Sarah nodded. Not only did they know, but they protected him, and they were prepared to protect themselves if things went south. She flipped to another page. "This one's from Caldwell again. It was sent 2 days ago." Jonathan read the message carefully. It referenced a series of financial transfers, large sums of money being moved offshore to undisclosed accounts. The timing was too precise to be a coincidence. Someone had started covering their tracks before Richard was even fired. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. So Richard was never the real problem. He was just convenient. Sarah hesitated, or disposable. Before Jonathan could respond, his phone buzzed. A new email. He opened it, expecting another routine message from the legal team. Instead, what he saw sent a chill down his spine. The subject line read, "You took down the wrong man." His grip on the phone tightened as he read the body of the message. Richard Miller was a useful distraction, but he was never in charge. "If you continue down this path, you will regret it. Walk away." No sender name, no traceable address, just a warning. Jonathan set the phone down slowly, his mind racing. This was no longer just about a corrupt restaurant manager. Someone with real power, was watching. And they were making it clear that they wouldn't let him dig any deeper without consequences. He looked up at Sarah, her expression mirroring his own growing concern. "This isn't just about Richard anymore," he said. "We're dealing with something much bigger." She nodded. "And now they know you're coming for them." Jonathan exhaled, his fingers tapping against the desk. He had spent years building this company, ensuring it stood for something real. If there was rot in the foundation, he wasn't going to ignore it. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in a long time. "We need to talk," he said. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Jonathan sat at the head of a long mahogany conference table in a private meeting room within Reed Dining Group's headquarters. The blinds were drawn, and the only illumination came from the dim overhead lighting and the soft glow of laptop screens. It was late, past midnight, but no one in the room showed signs of leaving. There was too much at stake. Sarah sat to his right, her arms crossed, scanning a printed set of documents in front of her. Ethan leaned forward with his elbows on the table, his fingers interlocked, an anxious energy radiating off him. At the far end of the table was Nick Foster, a cybersecurity specialist within the company's IT division, one of the few people Jonathan knew he could trust. "We need to understand the full scope of this," Jonathan said, his voice measured. "Richard was corrupt, but I don't believe for a second that he was working alone. Someone else gave him protection. Someone higher up." Nick nodded, adjusting his glasses. He was younger than the rest, sharp-eyed and meticulous, with the kind of analytical mind that had made him indispensable in previous corporate investigations. He tapped a few keys on his laptop and turned the screen toward the group. "There's something bigger going on here," Nick said. "I started digging into the financial records for Le Grand Luxe after Sarah flagged those suspicious transactions. What I found was, Troubling. He clicked on a file, and a series of financial reports appeared on the screen. The numbers looked standard at first glance, but as Nick zoomed in, patterns began to emerge. These adjustments to the books, they aren't random. The system was tampered with multiple times over the last 2 years. Not just at Le Grand Luxe, but at other locations too. Jonathan leaned in. How many? Nick hesitated. At least 7, possibly more, each one showing irregularities in financial transfers, expense reports, and payroll distributions. Sarah exhaled sharply. This isn't just about Richard. This is a network. Jonathan nodded slowly. Money laundering. Ethan stiffened. You think someone's using the company to funnel illegal money? Nick turned the laptop back toward himself and tapped a few more keys. I think someone's been moving large sums of money through multiple locations, altering records just enough to avoid detection. And here's the kicker. Some of those funds have been wired offshore. Jonathan processed the information carefully. This was no longer just about cleaning up one corrupt restaurant. This was about an entire system operating within his company, using his brand, his reputation, as cover. We need to know who's behind this, he said, and we need to move quickly. Nick adjusted his glasses. There's more. He pulled up an email chain, several messages exchanged between Mark Caldwell, the finance director who had tried to protect Richard, and an unidentified recipient. The tone of the messages was tense. We have a problem. One of them, Reed. Miller was supposed to be a buffer. Now Reed is paying attention. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. They knew I'd eventually start looking. Sarah frowned. Which means they have a backup plan. Across town, in a sleek office overlooking the city skyline, Mark Caldwell sat across from a man whose presence carried an undeniable weight. His name was Graham Layton, a senior board member with influence that stretched far beyond Reed Dining Group. Unlike Richard, who had flaunted his power, Graham operated in the shadows, ensuring that every decision served a greater agenda. He's going too far, Graham said, tapping his fingers against the desk. Richard was a problem, yes, but Reed is becoming something else entirely. A liability. Mark nodded. He's not stopping. He's already connecting the dots. If we don't act now, it won't just be him coming for us, it'll be the SEC, the IRS, the feds. Graham leaned back in his chair, considering. Then we make him the story. If we can't control his investigation, we bury him in his own. Mark hesitated. You're suggesting we fabricate something? Graham's lips curled slightly. I'm suggesting we give people a reason to stop listening to him. The plan was set into motion within hours. The next morning, Jonathan arrived at the office only to find the building buzzing with tension. Employees whispered in the hallways, eyes darting away when he passed. Something was wrong. He had seen this kind of reaction before, right before a scandal broke. His assistant met him at the door of his office, her expression tight. You need to see this, she said, handing him a tablet. Jonathan took it and glanced at the screen. His stomach clenched. A headline from one of the city's top business publications blared across the front page. Reed Dining Group CEO under investigation for financial misconduct. He scrolled through the article, his grip tightening on the device. The report cited anonymous sources claiming that Jonathan had misused company funds for personal gain. It referenced leaked emails he had never written, suggesting improper financial activity. The details were damning. Ethan and Sarah burst into the office moments later, both looking shaken. This is a setup, Ethan said. They're trying to destroy you before you can expose them. Jonathan nodded, setting the tablet down. I expected them to retaliate. I just didn't think they'd move this fast. Sarah crossed her arms. What do we do? Jonathan exhaled, steadying himself. We fight. He looked out the window at the city below. This wasn't about one corrupt executive anymore. It was about the system they had built around themselves. A system that would do anything to protect its own. They had just declared war. And Jonathan had no intention of losing. Jonathan stood near the window of his office, staring at the city skyline. The morning sun cast long shadows across the glass towers. But his mind was elsewhere. His phone vibrated with another news alert. He already knew what it would say. For the past 12 hours, every major business outlet had been running the same story. Headlines splashed across websites and newspapers accused him of misappropriating company funds. Phrases like financial misconduct and corporate scandal were thrown around with reckless certainty. On his desk, a copy of the day's newspaper lay open. Reed Dining Group CEO under investigation for embezzlement. Is this the end for Jonathan Reed? It was exactly the kind of damage his enemies wanted. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was perception. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Sarah stepped in first, followed by Ethan and Nick. The three of them carried the weight of bad news in their expressions. "You've seen it?" Sarah asked, motioning to the newspaper. Jonathan nodded. "It's a well-played move. They didn't come after me with legal charges, they went straight to public perception. If I lose credibility, I lose the company. And if I lose the company, the investigation dies with me." Nick opened his laptop, setting it on Jonathan's desk. "I started looking into the source of the leaked emails. They were sent from a foreign server. But there's something off about them." He tapped a few keys, pulling up a series of logs and code strings. They look like real messages at first glance. But when you check the metadata, the timestamps don't match. Someone tampered with them before they were sent. Jonathan leaned in. "Which means, whoever fabricated these emails didn't just forge content, they went a step further. They made it look like you were redirecting company funds into personal accounts." Ethan frowned. "But that's impossible. The company's financial statements are publicly audited. Wouldn't someone notice?" Nick adjusted his glasses. "Not if the changes were subtle enough. If you move money through intermediary accounts and adjust the numbers just slightly, it can slip through normal audits." Sarah exhaled. This wasn't rushed. They've been setting this up for a long time. Jonathan clenched his jaw. "Can you trace it back?" Nick hesitated. "That's where it gets interesting. The fake transfers were funneled through accounts linked to Mark Caldwell." Silence settled over the room. Caldwell, the same financial director who had tried to defend Richard Miller. Jonathan crossed his arms. "That's not a coincidence." Sarah looked at Nick. "Can you prove he was directly involved?" Nick shook his head. "Not yet, but I found something else. There's a separate set of financial movements that connect to an offshore account. And that account is linked to someone else, Graham Layton." Jonathan stiffened. The senior board member, the man who had quietly stayed in the background while Richard took the fall. Ethan let out a low whistle. So Richard was just the front man. Caldwell was managing the numbers. But Layton was the real power behind this. Jonathan tapped his fingers against the desk, his mind working through the pieces. If they've been operating this scheme for years, Richard's downfall would have been a liability. They needed a bigger distraction. He motioned to the newspaper. And they found one. Sarah folded her arms. "So what do we do? If we go public now, without solid proof, it'll look like you're trying to shift blame. They'll use it against you." Jonathan nodded. "We need more than just circumstantial evidence. We need someone inside their network to confirm it." A moment later, Jonathan's phone buzzed. A number he didn't recognize flashed on the screen. He answered. "Reed speaking." A voice on the other end was hushed. "Careful, Mr. Reed. You don't know me, but I know what's happening to you. And I know who's behind it." Jonathan's pulse quickened. "Who is this?" "A former employee. Someone who got too close to the truth." The man hesitated. "I was a regional director. Until Layton forced me out." Jonathan exchanged a glance with Sarah and Ethan. "You have proof?" A long pause. "I have more than proof. I have names, dates, transactions, everything you need. But if they know I talked to you, they'll make sure I disappear like the others." Jonathan's grip on the phone tightened. "Then let's make sure they don't see it coming." The man on the other end exhaled sharply. "Meet me tonight. I'll send the details." The line went dead. Jonathan set the phone down. His enemies thought they had put him on the defensive. They were wrong. Jonathan sat in the back of a dimly lit cafe. The low hum of quiet conversations blending with the occasional clink of coffee cups against saucers. Across from him sat Linda Garrett, a veteran journalist known for her investigative work. She had exposed corruption in corporate and political circles before. But this was different. This was personal. She flipped through the documents Jonathan had handed her, her eyes scanning the pages with the precision of someone trained to spot inconsistencies. After several moments, she leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the table. "This is explosive," she said, her voice steady but laced with caution. "You're accusing members of your own board of orchestrating fraud, money laundering, and character assassination." Jonathan nodded. "Because it's the truth." Linda let out a slow breath. "You realize that if you're wrong, this will destroy what's left of your career." Jonathan met her gaze. "And if I'm right, it'll destroy them." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right, let's do this." The interview was arranged within hours. No corporate-controlled networks, no PR firms filtering the message. Just an independent journalist with a reputation for integrity and a man ready to take back control of his own narrative. The setting was simple. Jonathan sitting across from Linda in a quiet studio. The camera was rolling, but there was no flash, no staged backdrop, just two people speaking, one asking the hard questions, the other refusing to back down. Linda started with the most obvious. "Mr. Reed, you've been accused of financial misconduct, with leaked emails suggesting you funneled corporate funds into personal accounts. How do you respond to that?" Jonathan remained calm. "I respond with facts. Those emails were fabricated. The transactions they reference don't exist. And the people behind this wanted one thing: to remove me before I could expose what was really happening within the company." She tilted her head slightly. "And what is really happening?" Jonathan placed a folder on the table between them. A coordinated effort to siphon money from Reed Dining Group through offshore accounts, disguised as operational costs. This has been happening for years, under the direction of individuals far more powerful than Richard Miller. Linda opened the folder, flipping through financial reports, email records, and bank statements. "These are serious accusations," she said. "Who's responsible?" Jonathan didn't hesitate. "Mark Caldwell and Graham Layden. They protected Richard for as long as he was useful. But once I started asking questions, they needed a scapegoat. That's why they fabricated the story about me. It was never about exposing corruption. It was about burying me before I could get too close to the truth." Linda absorbed the information, nodding slowly. Then she asked the question Jonathan had been expecting. "You claim the emails were fabricated. Do you have proof?" Jonathan gestured to Nick, who was seated just off camera. The young IT specialist stepped forward, placing another document in front of Linda. "We analyzed the leaked emails," Nick said. "The timestamps were altered, the metadata manipulated. They originated from a server in Eastern Europe but were routed through a network with ties to Caldwell's department." Linda held up the document to the camera. "If this is true, it means the allegations against you are baseless. Have you taken legal action?" Jonathan shook his head. "Not yet. First, I needed to make sure the public understood what was happening. Caldwell and Layden operate in the shadows. They use misinformation as a weapon. This interview is my way of making sure people start asking the right questions." The interview lasted 40 minutes. By the time it ended, Jonathan had done what he set out to do. He had turned the accusations against him into a larger story about corporate corruption. Within hours, the response began. Some media outlets dismissed the claims as damage control, but others, especially those critical of corporate power, picked up the story. Questions emerged. Why had no formal charges been filed against Jonathan? Why had Caldwell and Layden remained silent? Why had the alleged financial misconduct only surfaced after Jonathan began his internal investigation? The narrative was shifting, but Jonathan knew it wouldn't last long. Caldwell and Layden wouldn't sit back and let him control the story. They would retaliate, and they did. That night, as Jonathan reviewed the growing media coverage, his phone buzzed with an urgent call from Sarah. "You need to see this," she said, her voice tense. Minutes later, Jonathan stood in front of a television screen in his office, watching a breaking news report. A serious-looking anchor spoke in measured tones. The headline at the bottom of the screen stark and chilling. "Reed Dining Group whistleblower killed in car crash, police investigating possible foul play." Jonathan's stomach dropped. The screen cut to footage of a mangled vehicle on the side of a highway. The reporter continued. The victim, identified as Daniel Moore, was a former regional director at Reed Dining Group. He had recently come forward with allegations of financial misconduct within the company. Jonathan's hands clenched into fists. Daniel Moore, the man who had called him just hours before, offering to testify. Now he was dead. Sarah turned to Jonathan, her face pale. We both know that wasn't an accident. Jonathan didn't speak. His mind was already racing, calculating his next move. Layden and Caldwell had sent a message. This wasn't just about boardroom power plays anymore. This was war. The boardroom was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Jonathan sat at the long oak table, his hands clasped in front of him. Across from him, Graham Layden sat with his usual composed expression. But there was something else in his eyes today, something sharp. Predatory, the kind of look a man gave when he knew he was about to win. Mark Caldwell sat to Layden's left, fingers tapping idly on the table. A few other board members exchanged glances, some avoiding Jonathan's gaze altogether. They were nervous, unsure which side to be on. And that was exactly what Layden was counting on. Layden cleared his throat. Gentlemen, I think we can all agree that the past few days have been disruptive, to say the least. The press coverage, the accusations, the instability, it's damaging to our company. And at the center of it all is Jonathan Reed. Jonathan remained silent. He had expected this. Layden continued, his voice measured. While Mr. Reed's leadership has been valuable, his recent actions have put us in an untenable position. Public confidence is wavering. Investors are questioning their trust in us. And frankly, we cannot afford more uncertainty. Caldwell leaned forward, playing his part. That's why we're proposing a temporary suspension of Mr. Reed from his position as CEO. Effective immediately, while an internal review is conducted. There it was, the move they had been planning all along. Jonathan studied the faces around the table. A few were visibly uneasy. Others, like Caldwell and Layden, were resolute. The rest were waiting to see where the majority swayed before choosing a side. Sarah, who had been standing near the door, stepped forward. With all due respect, this isn't about the company's stability. It's about silencing the one person trying to expose what's really happening here. Layden smiled, unbothered. Ms. Carter, let's leave the conspiracy theories out of this, shall we? Jonathan exhaled slowly. He knew arguing would be pointless. The votes had already been decided before this meeting even started. The only thing left was the formality of the process. Layden straightened his tie. We'll proceed with a vote. Those in favor of suspending Mr. Reed pending an internal review, please indicate so now. Hands went up around the table. Some hesitated before following suit, their faces filled with reluctance. Jonathan kept his expression unreadable as the count was finalized. 11 votes in favor, 3 against. Layden folded his hands. Motion passes. Effective immediately. Jonathan Reed is suspended from his role as CEO of Reed Dining Group for 30 days. During this period, I will assume interim leadership to ensure the company remains stable. Jonathan didn't flinch. He stood, buttoning his jacket with a calm that was far from what he actually felt. I understand. Layden's lips curled slightly. I hope you do. The meeting adjourned, and the board members began filing out. Some patted Jonathan on the shoulder as they left, offering meaningless words of reassurance. Others avoided him entirely. As Jonathan turned toward the exit, a voice called after him. Mr. Reed. He turned to see Alan Whitaker, one of the board's longest-serving members, C9. A man who had remained neutral throughout the internal power struggle, never openly supporting Jonathan but never siding against him either. Whitaker stepped closer, lowering his voice. You need to be careful. Jonathan arched a brow. I thought I just lost my job. What else should I be worried about? Whitaker glanced around before continuing. Layden isn't just trying to push you out. He's making moves behind the scenes, big ones. There's talk of an offshore transaction, a massive shift of company funds. Jonathan's expression darkened. He's cashing out. Whitaker nodded. And fast. Whatever he's planning, it's happening soon. Jonathan exhaled, his mind already racing. How do you know this? Whitaker hesitated. Let's just say I've been around long enough to know when someone's about to cut and run. Jonathan studied the older man for a moment before nodding. I appreciate the warning. Whitaker lowered his voice even further. You have 30 days before this suspension becomes permanent. That's your window. Jonathan glanced toward the glass doors leading out to the main corridor. Beyond them, the towering structure of Reed Dining Group loomed over the city. This was no longer about saving his job. This was about stopping whatever Layden was planning before it was too late. Jonathan sat in a dimly lit office. An old safe house he used years ago during internal audits of his company. The air smelled of stale coffee and paper, and the only source of light was the glow from multiple laptop screens. Sarah paced near the window, arms crossed, while Ethan stood beside her, tension visible in his posture. Across the room, Nick Foster, their IT specialist, was furiously typing on his keyboard, sifting through layers of encrypted data. "We don't have much time," Jonathan said, his voice calm but urgent. "Layden knows I won't just disappear quietly. He'll be working to erase every trace of his involvement before the board finalizes my removal." Nick's fingers didn't stop moving. "I'm in," he muttered. "And you were right. There's a hidden account. Multiple offshore transfers, all routed through subsidiaries that don't technically exist on paper. They've been skimming money off the company's finances for years, using shell corporations to launder it." Jonathan leaned forward. "Who owns the final account?" Nick hesitated before turning the screen toward him. A single name flashed across the document. "Graham Layton." Ethan let out a slow whistle. "That's it. That's what we need to take him down." Sarah frowned. "It's not enough. If we go public with just financial records, Layton will deny everything. He'll claim it was a clerical error, blame it on Caldwell, and walk away clean." Jonathan nodded. "We need something undeniable, something that ties him directly to the corruption." Nick's screen flickered. A new window popped up. "Wait. There's a secondary database I just accessed. It's buried deep in the system. Someone tried to wipe it recently, but I found a backup." He clicked on a folder marked Confidential Transactions. A series of scanned documents appeared. One stood out immediately: a contract between Layton and an offshore holding company. Jonathan's stomach tightened. This is it. This document proves Layton authorized the financial transfers himself. No intermediaries, no deniability. Sarah's expression darkened. Then why didn't he destroy it completely? Nick exhaled. He tried, but someone made a backup before it could be erased. Jonathan's phone buzzed. A blocked number. He answered, motioning for silence in the room. A shaky voice came through the line. "Mr. Reed, I have something you need to see." Jonathan recognized the voice immediately. It was Daniel Crawford, a former senior accountant at Reed Dining Group. He had worked under Caldwell before suddenly resigning last year. "You have proof?" Jonathan asked. There was a pause. "Yes, but I can't talk here. I need to meet in person." "Where?" Another hesitation. "Pier 17. 1 hour. Come alone." Sarah shook her head. "It's a trap." "Probably," Jonathan admitted. "But if he has what we need, it's worth the risk." Ethan frowned. "Then we're not letting you go alone." Jonathan met his gaze. He wasn't about to argue. An hour later, Jonathan and Ethan arrived at the docks. The air was thick with mist rolling in from the bay, and the pier was nearly deserted. A few distant figures moved in the shadows, but nothing seemed immediately threatening. Daniel Crawford stood near the water, his coat pulled tightly around him. He looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder repeatedly. Jonathan approached cautiously. "Daniel." The man's eyes darted between them before he held out a flash drive. "Everything is on here. Layton's personal authorizations, bank logs, conversations he had with Caldwell about laundering funds." Jonathan reached for it, but before he could take it, a sudden noise echoed through the docks. A car engine. Headlights flared to life. Daniel's face turned pale. "They found me." Tires screeched as a black SUV sped toward them. Ethan grabbed Daniel's arm, pulling him back as Jonathan yanked him to the side. The vehicle skidded to a stop, and two masked men jumped out, guns drawn. "Run!" Jonathan shouted. Ethan shoved Daniel toward the alley between the warehouses, and they sprinted. Gunfire erupted behind them, bullets ricocheting off metal containers. Jonathan ducked behind a stack of crates. Heart pounding. Daniel tripped, dropping the flash drive. It slid across the concrete. Jonathan lunged for it, but one of the masked men reached it first. The man crushed it under his boot. Jonathan cursed. That was their best shot. Ethan tackled the man from behind, sending him sprawling. The second attacker turned his gun toward them, but before he could fire, a security siren blared through the docks. Flashing red lights filled the area as patrol vehicles approached. The masked men hesitated for half a second before scrambling back toward their SUV. The vehicle peeled away, disappearing into the night. Jonathan exhaled, helping Daniel to his feet. "Are you hurt?" Daniel shook his head. "No, but they got the drive." Sarah's voice crackled through Jonathan's earpiece. "What the hell just happened?" "The scanner I set up picked up gunfire." Jonathan steadied himself. "Layden sent people after Crawford. They destroyed the flash drive." There was a pause. Then Nick's voice came through. "Maybe not completely." Jonathan frowned. "What do you mean?" Nick's tone was cautious but hopeful. "Before you left, I mirrored your phone to the drive. I have a partial copy of the files." Jonathan's pulse quickened. "How much?" "Enough." Jonathan exchanged a look with Ethan. They weren't out of danger yet. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. They still had a chance to bring everything to light. And now, there was no turning back. The grand ballroom of the Manhattan Regent Hotel was packed. Reporters, financial analysts, and high-ranking executives filled the seats, their eyes fixed on the podium at the front of the room. The air was thick with tension, the kind that came when a major revelation was about to unfold. Cameras flashed, microphones were adjusted, and the murmur of voices blended into an anxious hum. Jonathan stood in the wings, steadying himself. This was it, the moment everything hinged on. The moment to expose Graham Layden for what he truly was. Sarah leaned in, whispering, "You're sure about this?" Jonathan gave a slight nod. "There's no turning back now." A hotel staff member motioned to him, signaling that it was time. Jonathan stepped onto the stage, the room instantly falling silent. He scanned the crowd, seeing the mix of anticipation, skepticism, and quiet curiosity. Then, he began. "In the past several days, you've heard my name attached to accusations of financial misconduct. You've read headlines questioning my integrity, my leadership, my ethics, and yet, none of you have been given the full story until now." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle before he continued. "What you are about to see is the truth. Not speculation, not rumor, but hard evidence of a financial conspiracy that has been operating within Reed Dining Group for years. A conspiracy led by none other than Graham Layden." He turned to the large screen behind him. Nick, stationed at a secure location, remotely accessed the feed, displaying the first set of documents. The audience leaned forward as the information appeared in crisp, glaring detail. "These are offshore bank transactions." Jonathan continued, pointing to the figures. "Money funneled out of the company, disguised as operational expenses, then rerouted into accounts controlled by Layden. For years, he has been siphoning funds while manipulating board decisions to protect himself." A murmur swept through the room. The reporters scribbled notes furiously. Some gasped, others exchanged glances. But Jonathan wasn't done. "Here's an internal email from Mark Caldwell to Layden, discussing the need to remove obstacles like me and any employee who got too close to the truth." Another document appeared on the screen, detailing Layden's direct involvement in laundering millions. "And here," Jonathan said, voice steady but sharp, "is the proof that Layden personally authorized the falsification of financial records. This was never about my alleged misconduct. It was about eliminating the only person standing in the way of a decades-long fraud operation." A new wave of reactions swept the room. The board members present shifted uncomfortably. A few pulled out their phones, likely sending frantic messages. Then came the final blow. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce the man who has been in hiding after being threatened for knowing too much, Daniel Crawford." A door at the back of the ballroom opened. Every head turned as Crawford, the former accountant, stepped inside. The room tensed. His appearance was unexpected, his presence undeniable. Crawford walked toward the stage, taking the microphone. He swallowed hard but stood firm. "I worked in Reed Dining Group's financial department for 6 years." He began. "And I saw everything. I was ordered to manipulate records. I was told to make losses look like profits and to bury money trails that led straight to Layden's offshore accounts. And when I refused, I was forced out." Layden, seated near the back, stood abruptly. His face was red with fury, his composure slipping. "This is a setup," he barked. "This man is a liar." Jonathan stayed calm, his eyes locking onto Layden's. "Then why is your name on every authorization document?" The room fell into stunned silence. Layden's mouth opened, But no words came out. The proof was irrefutable. Then, chaos erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed wildly. Some board members rose to leave, realizing the sinking ship they had been aboard. Others turned on Layton, demanding answers. But the real climax was yet to come. A sudden commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, flanking a man in a suit who held up a warrant. "Mr. Graham Layton, you are under arrest for financial fraud, conspiracy to commit embezzlement, and obstruction of justice." Layton's face drained of color. He stepped back, hands raising slightly in protest. "You can't do this. I have rights. This is enough." The officer interrupted. "We have enough evidence to put you away for a long time. Don't make it worse." As they moved toward him, Layton made a last, desperate attempt to flee. He shoved past chairs, knocking over a table, but it was no use. The officers caught him before he reached the exit. Handcuffs clicked into place. Jonathan watched as they led him away. The once powerful man reduced to a desperate figure in a cheap struggle for escape. The room slowly settled, but the damage was done. The board members who had stood by Layton were left exposed. Some scrambled to salvage what they could. Others remained silent, knowing their complicity had been laid bare. Sarah let out a breath beside Jonathan. "It's over." Jonathan glanced at the wreckage of Layton's empire and shook his head. Almost. Because while the battle had been won, the war for Reed Dining Group's future had just begun. The fallout was immediate. Within hours of Graham Layton's arrest, Reed Dining Group's stock plummeted. Investors scrambled to distance themselves, and financial analysts flooded the news with dire predictions about the company's future. Reports of internal corruption, money laundering, and embezzlement dominated the headlines. What had once been a prestigious empire in the hospitality industry was now tainted by scandal. Jonathan sat in his office, watching the numbers flicker across the stock ticker on his screen. The boardroom, once a place of calculated power plays and high-stakes decisions, now felt like a battlefield littered with casualties. Half of the executives who had once sat around the polished oak table were either fired, under investigation, or desperately trying to salvage their reputations. A special board meeting had been called to address the crisis. Sarah stood near the window, arms crossed, while Ethan reviewed financial reports at the long table. Across from them, several remaining board members whispered among themselves, their expressions a mix of worry and resignation. One of them, a senior member named Roger Whitmore, cleared his throat. "We have 2 options, gentlemen," he announced, breaking the silence. "We either begin a complete overhaul of this company, tearing out every piece of corruption from the inside, or we sell it off before it collapses completely." A murmur spread through the room. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, considering his next words carefully. He had spent years building this company from the ground up, pouring his blood and sweat into its success. The thought of selling it, of walking away, was almost unthinkable, but he also knew that repairing the damage would be an uphill battle, one that could take years. Ethan set down his report. "Selling it means giving control to an outside corporation. Who's to say they won't just continue the same corruption under a different name?" Sarah nodded. "We have a chance here. A chance to set a precedent, to prove that a company can survive without the greed and backroom deals. But we need leadership that won't bend to pressure." All eyes turned to Jonathan. He exhaled slowly, glancing around the room. "If we do this, we do it right. That means no more looking the other way. No more silent deals to protect profits. We root out the corruption completely, no matter how long it takes." A silence hung in the air. Then Roger nodded. "Then we move forward with the restructuring plan." The decision was made, but Jonathan knew the battle wasn't over. In the days that followed, the company underwent drastic changes. Ethan was reinstated, this time as a department head overseeing customer service policies, ensuring that the mistreatment of employees never happened again. Sarah, after proving her loyalty and leadership, was promoted to an executive role, placed in charge of corporate restructuring. Caldwell, the former CFO who had helped orchestrate much of the fraud, had fled overseas. Authorities had issued an international warrant for his arrest, but whether he would ever be caught remained uncertain. Meanwhile, Daniel Crawford, the accountant who had risked everything to expose the scheme, was now preparing to testify in the upcoming trial against Layton. The more they dug, the more corruption they found. Old deals, forged documents, and suspicious transactions surfaced, revealing that Layton had been only part of a much larger problem. The company had been rotting from within for years. One evening, as Jonathan sat alone in his office, a courier arrived with a plain envelope. No return address, no markings, just his name on the front. He hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. You removed a pawn, but the system remains intact. We will return. Jonathan's grip on the paper tightened. The words were a warning, maybe even a promise. For a moment, he considered what it meant. If there were others still out there, still pulling strings from the shadows, how far were they willing to go? Would they try to reclaim what they had lost? He walked to the window, looking down at the city below. The lights stretched out for miles. A reminder that power never truly disappeared, it simply shifted hands. He had won this battle, but deep down, he knew the war was far from over. The boardroom was packed, yet the atmosphere felt eerily empty. Tension coiled in the air like a thick fog, pressing down on every individual seated at the long, polished table. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual chaos, oblivious to the high-stakes battle taking place behind closed doors. Jonathan sat at the head of the table, his face unreadable. The past few weeks had taken their toll. His body was exhausted, his mind sharp as ever. This meeting would determine not just his fate, but the fate of Reed Dining Group itself. Across from him, Roger Whitmore, one of the longest-serving board members, cleared his throat. His expression was carefully neutral, but Jonathan could sense the calculation behind his gaze. Jonathan, I'll get straight to the point. The company is in crisis. The media won't let go of this scandal. Investors are pulling out, and public trust is at an all-time low. We need stability, and that means making a decision, now. Jonathan leaned back, his fingers steepled together. And what decision are we talking about exactly? Whitmore exchanged a glance with another board member before continuing. You step down, effective immediately. We sell the company to a private equity firm that has already expressed interest in acquiring Reed Dining Group. They'll handle the transition, rebrand if necessary, and put this whole mess behind us. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He wasn't surprised. The vultures had been circling for days, waiting for the perfect moment to swoop in. And what happens to the employees? The restaurants? Whitmore shrugged. Some will stay, some won't. That's business. A murmur rippled through the room. A few board members shifted uncomfortably. Others, particularly those who had supported Graham Layton, nodded in silent agreement. Jonathan exhaled slowly. And the other option? A younger board member, Lisa Carmichael, spoke up. You stay, but it won't be easy. The company needs a complete overhaul. We'd have to bring in an external auditing firm, restructure leadership, and probably cut ties with anyone remotely linked to the corruption scandal. That includes some of the people in this very room. The tension thickened. Several faces turned pale. Whitmore scoffed. And how do you expect to do that, Jonathan? The moment you announce an internal purge, stock prices will plummet even further. No investor wants to be part of a sinking ship. Jonathan studied the faces around him. Some were desperate to rid themselves of the chaos, willing to sacrifice the company's identity to do so. Others, like Carmichael, still had faith that Reed Dining Group could be saved. Then, unexpectedly, another voice cut through the noise. I disagree. Every head turned to look at Arthur Sinclair, a veteran board member who had remained largely silent throughout the meeting. Sinclair folded his hands together. If we sell now, we're doing exactly what the guilty parties want us to do, sweeping everything under the rug so they can walk away unscathed. If we fight back, we send a message to our employees, to our customers, to every corporation out there that thinks it can operate without accountability. Reed Dining Group can recover, but not if we take the coward's way out. Jonathan observed the shift in the room. Sinclair's words had struck a chord. A few board members nodded hesitantly, reconsidering their stance. Before Whitmore could respond, Jonathan's phone vibrated in his pocket. He ignored it, but a moment later, Sarah entered the room, her face pale. She leaned down and whispered, "We have a problem." Jonathan glanced at her. What kind of problem? She slid a tablet in front of him. This just leaked. Jonathan's eyes flicked to the screen. His heart stopped. It was a confidential document, now plastered across multiple news outlets. A financial agreement between a shadow investment group and certain board members of Reed Dining Group. The document detailed the sale of the company, without full board approval. If the deal went through, thousands of employees would be laid off, and Reed Dining Group would cease to exist as an independent entity. A stunned silence filled the room as the board members read the document. Whitmore's face darkened. This is out of context. Jonathan stood up, pushing the tablet aside. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable steel beneath it. You were planning to sell this company behind closed doors. You weren't saving Reed Dining Group. You were stripping it for parts. The room erupted into a cacophony of protests and accusations. Some board members turned on Whitmore, demanding explanations. Others tried to deny any involvement. Jonathan let them argue for a moment before raising a hand. The room fell silent. I've made my decision, he said, his voice unwavering. I'm staying. Reed Dining Group will not be sold, and I will personally oversee its restructuring. Whitmore shook his head. You don't have the votes to stop this. Jonathan's gaze was sharp. I don't need them, because as of this moment, I'm calling for a full shareholder meeting. And when the public finds out what you tried to do, you won't have the votes either. Whitmore's face twisted in rage, but he knew he had lost. Jonathan turned to Sarah. Get everything ready. We go public in an hour. Sarah nodded and left the room, her steps quick and determined. Jonathan looked around the boardroom one last time. He had fought too hard to let this company fall into the wrong hands. If the system was broken, then it was time to rebuild it from the ground up. He wasn't just fighting for Reed Dining Group. He was fighting for every employee who had been mistreated, for every customer who had been deceived, for every person who believed that integrity still had a place in business. And he wasn't going anywhere. The conference hall was packed with reporters, cameras flashing as journalists whispered among themselves, anticipating what was about to unfold. The scandal surrounding Reed Dining Group had dominated headlines for weeks, and now, the man at the center of it all was about to make his final stand. Jonathan walked onto the stage, his expression composed, despite the exhaustion lining his face. His presence was commanding. He adjusted the microphone, scanning the room before speaking. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today. I won't waste your time. You've seen the accusations, the speculation, the chaos that has surrounded this company. But today, I'm here to set the record straight, not just for Reed Dining Group, but for the people who make this company what it is. A hush fell over the room as Jonathan held up a folder. This document, he continued, proves beyond a doubt that a faction within our own board attempted to orchestrate the sale of this company without full transparency. Their goal was not to save Reed Dining Group, but to strip it for profit, leaving thousands of employees without jobs while they walked away with millions. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as he laid the folder on the podium, opening it to display a series of financial records and internal emails. A live feed projected the documents onto a massive screen behind him. The evidence was damning. Reporters scribbled notes furiously. Some were already typing out breaking news alerts. Jonathan let the weight of the revelation settle before he spoke again. But that's not going to happen, he said, his voice steady. I made a decision the moment I started this company, to build something that stood for excellence, for integrity. That has been tested, nearly destroyed, but it will not be sold. Reed Dining Group will remain independent, and it will be rebuilt from the ground up. Applause erupted from the employees in attendance. Across various locations, restaurant staff gathered around televisions and smartphones, watching their CEO take control of the narrative. Social media exploded with posts from current and former employees, many of whom had remained silent until now. Within minutes, the backlash against the corrupt board members intensified. The pressure on the board was immediate. Shareholders, once hesitant, now demanded a re-evaluation of leadership. In an emergency meeting, those implicated in the scheme were forced to resign under mounting legal scrutiny. The remaining members had no choice but to reinstate Jonathan as CEO. He accepted the position, but not without conditions. He demanded full transparency moving forward, including an independent oversight committee to monitor the company's financial dealings. It was an unprecedented move, but necessary. The fallout was swift. Several executives faced criminal charges. The authorities expanded their investigation, uncovering offshore accounts linked to the scandal. Meanwhile, former allies of the ousted board members scrambled to distance themselves, knowing their careers were at stake. But Jonathan understood the truth. This was a battle won, not the war itself. Late that evening, long after the cameras had been packed away, he sat alone in his office, watching the city skyline. His company had survived, but corruption didn't disappear overnight. There would always be another challenge, another force waiting in the shadows. A notification lit up his phone. An anonymous email. You may have won this round, but the system remains. We will return. Jonathan exhaled, setting the phone down. He had expected this. He wasn't naive enough to believe this was the end. But he had made his choice. He wasn't just here to run a company. He was here to change the rules of the game. Power doesn't just come from a title. It comes from the courage to stand up when no one else will. Jonathan had the choice to walk away, to let corruption stay hidden in the shadows. Instead, he chose to expose the truth, knowing the battle was far from over. But what about the companies we don't see? The injustices that never make the headlines? How many systems are still protecting the powerful at the expense of the powerless? What would you have done in his place? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories of deception, power struggles, and hidden truths, don't forget to subscribe to Undercover Truths. There's always more beneath the surface.